Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight. Hopefully I can get through this fairly quick, and if you have any additional questions, basically I will touch on those at the end. I've got a few questions that I've been receiving from quite a few different people that I've got lined up that I'm just going to answer really quick, and I'll go through a few different topics. So let's get started and see what we can do here. So this seminar tonight is brought to you by theeducatedlandlord.com. Theeducatedlandlord.com is an extension of my other websites and is going to be more of a compilation of information for people who are landlords, are learning to become landlords, and might be ideal for many of you on the call here tonight. So if you have some time, pop over there and visit. You'll find a lot of the tips that I may have sent out to you already in emails, and some new ones will be popping up there continuously. And it's also where you'll see a lot of these recordings showing up. So be sure to register on there as well to get updates on upcoming training and other tips. So today's session is going to cover some of the common landlord questions. So recently I sent out an email to a bunch of my subscribers and asked what questions many of you had. And it turns out that many of you had similar questions. So I've taken that information and compiled it into this short little seminar tonight. There's 3 key questions I'm going to focus on. That's where the questions were really tied around. So to start out with, one of the big questions that pops up is property management. A lot of the landlords I talk to have had problem tenants, and basically they're just tired of dealing with tenants, and they're wondering if property management is the way to go. And for some it may be. So what I've created here is a quick little list of pros and cons. These are my thoughts on the pros and cons of using property management. And we're going to start with the pros. So the big pro is you don't have to deal with the tenants. If you've already had problem tenants and you've had a bunch of issues dealing with tenants, the last thing you want to do is continue to run into these same problems. And whether the market's not quite ready to sell your property, or you understand that it's a good vehicle as an investment and just want to hang on to it, just don't want to deal with the headaches, having a property management company deal with the tenants can be a good thing at points. The other pro is it'll give you more free time. If somebody else is managing your property and dealing with all the day-to-day operations, it'll free up a considerable amount of your time. And realistically, as a landlord, you don't have big batches of time you spend every month, but that 3 or 4 or 6 days of getting new tenants in can seem all-encompassing and all-consuming at times. So that's a good aspect of having a property manager. Some of the cons. This is a dual-edged sword. You don't get to deal with the tenants. Now on the pro side, I talked about not having to deal with tenants, but the con side now, you don't get to deal with them. So you don't know what tenants are actually going in your property. I find it very important to me to be able to actually meet the tenants and find out who they are when I'm putting them into my property. With a property manager, you won't be doing any of that. That'll all be done in the background by your property manager, and you will just find out a little bit later. Now, some property management companies allow you to finalize or approve the final tenants, and that might be a better route, but again, it depends how hands-on you want to be. This is the big one I find, less cash flow. Now, I deal with a lot of investors, and I consult with some of them from BC who own property in our area, and they actually use property managers, and they're willing to take the loss with the cash flow because they're looking at the big scheme of things and they look at it as a long-term investment. So if you're dealing with a tight cash flow situation, it may not be quite as good of an option for you. Managing the managers. This can often be the toughest part. I've again talked to many of these out of the area investors and property owners, and some of the hardest problems they run into are having poor property managers, or staying on top of the property managers, or trying to determine what they're getting charged for sometimes. A lot of the property managers, they do a standard 8 to 12% monthly charge, whether the property is vacant or not. And then there's all kinds of what's called a mystery charges that may appear. And this again isn't all property managers, but it does occur with some of them where you get extra charges for everything from screening tenants to credit apps to running ads. It all comes basically out of your pocketbook. It would normally, but now there's typically a little bit of extra cost added on as they've had it. So that's using a property manager, the pros and cons. So what about managing your own property? Well, here we come back to the tenants. And in my opinion, this is probably the most important part, dealing with the tenants. I find it's very important to know who I have in a property, and if they know me, I can have a better relationship with them. It gives me a little better control of the property. It allows me to know what's going on. I've got a good feel for the tenant after going through all the screening that I talk about in some of my other webinars, after spending some of the time with them to understand who they are. It just gives me more control. With the property manager, I may not even see inside of the property for 6 months or a year, which is not necessarily something I'd really like. And of course, more cash flow. So now I'm trading some of my time for dollars. So the time I put in comes back to me as my cash flow. And this won't work for everybody. Some people simply won't have time to commit to it, and they would take the trade-off of the lower cash flow. So that kind of encompasses the different options, gives you an idea of what you may be able to look at if you're looking at a property manager. And I guess, as I mentioned, less free time. That's where some of your time is going to get taken up. So that was the first part of the common landlord questions. Well, one of the other questions that I've been getting is credit checks. First, I guess, what does a credit check do for you? It gives you some history on the tenant. And we do credit checks on all of our regular rental properties for any of the tenants that we're putting into place. So basically the series goes, we do the screening, we get it narrowed down to a few tenants, we get it narrowed down to the one tenant that we want in the property, and then we do the reference checks, and then we do the credit checks. So once they've gone through all that stage, last thing we'll basically do is a credit check. Fees for a credit check are typically around the $20 to $25 range. So you don't want to do them on every tenant, and there's specific rules on having to have the tenant allow you to do the credit check. But what it'll do, it'll give you some history on how the tenant has dealt with payments in the past. You'll see examples of how they've dealt with their credit cards or previous payments, and most of the credit companies have it in a nicely laid out format that's a little confusing at first, but they typically have walkthroughs of what the information means. But it'll show you whether their history is not so good, which often repeats itself, whether it's perfect, which hopefully repeats itself, or whether it's downright bad and you know it's never going to change. So it's something to really take a look at. So two of the biggest credit check, well, not credit check companies, but the credit histories companies are Equifax and TransUnion. They keep their credit reports on just about everybody involved with credit. So they are the reports that you get back, and there's several different credit checking companies that will do the reports for you and look it up. The nice thing about Equifax, I can't confirm this with TransUnion right now. I know we've done this with Equifax before, but you can check your own credit. And if you're not in a hurry, it's a free service, basically the cost of an envelope. You have to send information in, and then they will send your credit report back to you. Usually 3 or 4 weeks later, it'll show up in the mail. And it's something I recommend for pretty well all landlords to check into, especially if you have a very common name. If you're Jack Smith, it is not uncommon to have several other Jack Smiths out there, and they don't necessarily track the credit history as well as they could, and sometimes maybe their bad credit shows up on your history. So it's just something that is well worthwhile checking into. You know, again, every 6 months to a year, it's free for yourself. You can also have potential tenants do this if you want to save some of the costs and have them pull their own credit report. Take some of the control out of your hands, but might be a viable option for you. The big question that I seem to get from a lot of the landlords is getting rent on time. For some reason, tenants seem to sometimes believe that it's okay to delay things for a little bit, and that just never sets well with the landlord because we still have our bills to pay. And one of the most important things to do when this occurs is to remind your tenants that it's a priority they pay their rent on time. If you don't set the stage for all your tenant relations and situations, they're going to expect that they can potentially get away with things. So if you're not immediately on late payments or NSF payments and contacting the tenant, you're setting the stage that they think that it's okay and they won't get in much trouble. if you remind them it's a priority, you remind them that you need to make payments, which requires them to make payments to you, it'll go a long ways to making sure they don't repeat the process. And as a landlord, I definitely want to make sure I get my rents on time. So setting up the scenario like this so they know that I'm not very happy and it's not a good environment is very, very important to me. So as I mentioned, that first issue sets a stage, so you have to make sure that you follow a fairly rigid set of procedures. You know, if they are going to be late that first time it happens, you need to take control. You need to let them know that you're a professional at this and their payments count and it's important. So if you don't take control, the tenants will understand they can get away with it. And often this is where landlords start running into problems. If you've been less than strict with them, they will start believing that they can get away with it all the time, and suddenly there's $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 in outstanding rent that a landlord is stuck with, and you get caught in the spiral of deciding, should I clamp down on them now, or do I have to be nice to them just so I can get my money, or do I just evict them and hope I can get my money later? Well, you won't get your money later. You are far too late now to clamp down, and you're just in a tough situation. So, as a landlord, when you get a late payment or an NSF payment, you should be re-explaining the lease agreement to the tenant, making it crystal clear to them that they need to pay their rent on the date specified or they're breaching the lease. Give them written notice. This is a 2-point issue. With written notice, it just looks that much more firmer. It looks like you're that much more authoritative. And it's nice backup if things go sour later. You now have some evidence that you can use and take to the tenant board if you need to evict them or whatever route you go. But you start compiling evidence in case it does go sour. And you reiterate the importance of getting paid on time. The whole landlord-tenant relationship basically hinges on you getting paid and providing proper housing for the tenant. So if they're not holding up their end, you're stuck in a tough situation as well. So you've got to make sure they understand the importance of you getting paid, and basically follow up. If there's some instance where they had an NSF check and they're going to get you a new check in 2 days, which is the wrong scenario, because they should never replace an NSF check with a check. It should always be cash, money order, or a bank draft. Follow up. Make sure you're on top of that. You know, don't wait and hope they come through. Stay on top of them. So some of the advanced tips that I have to help prevent these kind of issues, or just reiterate the point itself. I actually have clauses in my lease that state that I have a $15 a day late charge or penalty for late payments. Now, unbeknownst to most tenants, this is an unenforceable clause. So it basically gets thrown out if I take it to the eviction board. If I don't necessarily tell the tenant, it acts as a little bit of leverage, and it's something that I definitely point out when I read the lease to the tenant. When I first meet the tenant and we're going through the lease for the signing, I go through the majority of the points in the lease point by point, and the clause in my lease that talks about NSF charges and late charges are 2 areas that I explicitly go over, just to make a point that I don't tolerate them. Now, another tip that I know several landlords are using is creating a bonus for proper payment. So basically what they do is they are renting a property out for $1,200 a month, for instance, and they will give the tenant a $100 a month discount. They will offer them $1,100 a month based on the $1,200 lease, as long as all the payments are on time. As soon as there's an NSF charge or a late payment, that $100 bonus is gone and it's back to the full pop for the rent. So not all areas or locations will allow this. So you may want to check into your local landlord and tenant laws to make sure you can get away with it. Or it's just something that you push through and try to make work. It's a great incentive to keep the tenants paying the right amount on time, and if it does fail to go through, you've managed to boost your rent a little bit. And this one, a lot of landlords have a problem with, but sometimes it's better not to be the landlord. Sometimes it's better to just be the manager. If you have a company name or a numbered company that the tenants are paying to, if you just portray yourself as the manager, you end up becoming kind of a middleman, and you can control the scenario a little bit better. I don't particularly use this tactic, but I know several people who do. So when they're dealing with the tenant, and if there is an issue, they simply explain, you know, that the owner's not going to be very happy with this. I'm pretty sure about that. So I will talk to him, but I would suggest that you take care of the issue or get the payment prepared or come up with an alternative plan, and I will talk to him. And that's how you handle being just the manager. It just separates you that little bit and allows you to take a better position. So that was my quick run through of the common landlord questions that I seem to run into all the time. Thank you very much for spending some time with me, and hopefully it was informative for you. Again, it would be great if you could stop by the educatedlandlord.com, leave some feedback there, leave some questions or comments, and make sure you register. So I think that's everything. Got a couple more thanks off of there. So yeah, thank you everybody, and have a fantastic night. Bye now.